Welcome to We Are Valley, a podcast by Valley Medical Center, located in Renton, Washington. We Are Valley is dedicated to providing you bite-sized advice to improve your health and well-being and keep you updated on the latest medical guidance. This podcast is for informational purposes only and is not intended to be taken as medical advice. So please talk to your provider before making changes that will affect your health.
Hello and welcome to the We Are Valley podcast. I'm Kristen Bidwell. Today we're talking about something that affects nearly all of us, often without even realizing it. We're taking a closer look at digital overload, the effects of constant stimulation on our mental health, our focus and concentration, and even our relationships. To help us better understand what's happening and what we can do to reset, I'm joined by two mental health practitioners from Valley Psychiatry and Counseling Clinic, Catherine Murray, a licensed independent clinical social worker, and Dr. Rebecca Strong, a board-certified psychiatric mental health nurse practitioner. Thank you all for joining me today.
Thanks for having us.
So to start, I would love to learn a little bit more about you. If you can each share just a little bit more about your background and what brings you here.
My name's Catherine Murray. I'm a licensed independent clinical social worker, like Kristen said. I have been a psychotherapist more than 18 years now. So I started as a family therapist in child welfare. Then I moved to working in a community health clinic, managing a maternal behavioral health program that was integrated in that clinic. So that's when I really became a specialist in perinatal mental health, which I still practice, still specialize in. After that, I moved into private practice. I really took an interest in ADHD and neurodivergent brain styles. I'm very happy to be here.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Strong. I'm a psychiatric nurse practitioner, like you said. It's interesting that Catherine has a perinatal mental health background because that's actually where I started as well. I worked as a high-risk obstetrical nurse in a hospital setting for about 10 years. And then I worked in an OB clinic when I went back to get my doctorate for psychiatric mental health nursing. And at that time, my focus was perinatal mental health, and that's where I did a lot of my extra coursework. And then in time and over the course of private practice, I really started focusing more on ADHD specifically. And I've been working at Valley doing the adult ADHD assessments.
And I think all of that expertise is really going to inform our conversation today, which I've really been looking forward to. Personally, I think many of us have been hearing a lot recently about people wanting to cut back on their screen time, a lot of buzzwords like digital detox and breaking up with your phone. I think I've read at least 2 or 3 books that have come out recently about the topic. Why do you think that we are starting to feel overloaded with technology and that the aim to spend a little time away from our devices is getting so much traction right now?
I know for me, COVID was the time where the kind of constant being on your screen really started to happen. And that was the rise of telehealth. That's when I started doing telehealth appointments as a therapist. And it's one of those things where it can feel like a blessing and a curse. It's so nice to have access to all of these things online. You can do grocery deliveries. You can do your entire life online. You can do all of your medical appointments online. Mm-hmm. Kids can do school online. It's amazing. It's a great example of accessibility, but I also don't think that our lives, our brains were meant to be 100% online. So that's where I think people are having kind of a craving to get back to community connection. And I also think people are experiencing mental health symptoms or executive functioning symptoms and probably correctly are diagnosing that, at least partly due to being overloaded with screen time and device time.
Absolutely. I agree. Our brains were designed in the setting of interacting with others. We're a very relational type of organism. And in some ways, the increased accessibility through technology, it can create a sense of interconnectedness, but in a lot of ways, it can actually work in the inverse, where it actually creates distance, literal distance, you don't have to be in the same room with anyone anymore. And also distance on a human level. People are often much more bold with their words online than they would be perhaps in the same room.
We experienced kind of a cultural shift in that period where it's we don't need these spaces, we can do it all online. So I saw raising a child who was in middle school, who's now in college at that time. He like lost access to a lot of just like hangout spaces or just like being as opposed to doing. I personally feel a lot of pressure to be doing all the time. And I think many adults have felt that way for a long, long time, but it's felt really amplified for me in the last few years. And I'm like, well, if I'm sitting, I have my phone, I can do an infinite number of tasks on my phone, so I better be doing.
Wow, I can totally relate to that. I think many people can. I was thinking about the connectedness online and in the workplace. When we have an in-person meeting now, it feels so novel, but we get so much more done. We can be more creative and thoughtful, and I feel like more ideas are flowing when we're in the same room together versus on a Teams call or on a phone call.
Yeah.
I want to share some numbers because I've seen screen time being equated to someday we'll look at all the screen time we're doing right now. Like we look at smoking from, several decades ago or driving without seatbelts. And I was looking at this fascinating TED Talk, which we can link in the show notes, that showed a dot for every month left in an average 18-year-old's life if they were to live to be 90, after accounting for things like sleep and work and school, cooking and eating, etc. I found this startling. The average 18-year-old was on pace to spend 93% of their remaining free time for the rest of their lives looking at a screen, or about 26 years. Yeah.
That's blowing my mind.
I know. And when you see the dots, it's like, wow, this is where we're choosing to spend our time. And it's startling. I'd love to hear from you both on when you equate that into real life, what impact are you seeing in your practices? And is this really impacting our mental health and well-being?
Catherine, you used the word accessibility at one point when talking about like the increased ability to do most things online. And at first, that is one of the things I really loved about leaning into technology more, especially during COVID. And also, coming from that perinatal mental health standpoint, it is incredibly hard to get out of the house when you have a new baby, especially if you have the added layers of increased anxiety or depression or lack of support, lack of infrastructure, like not having a car, for example. And so to have less barrier to mental health through like telehealth, for example, seemed like such a good thing. But my mind is still stuck on that statistic of 26 years. I'm not so sure we should be that accessible.
It's hard for me to think of screen time in such like a black and white way, like it's universally good or it's universally bad, or, comparing it to like cigarettes or being in a car without a seatbelt. I'm wondering about like the analogy of more like having a phone or a device could be more like the food we eat. Right?
Mm-hmm.
There's some food we eat that's like really great and nourishing and enriching. And then there's other food we eat that like makes you feel really sick. And maybe part of that depends on how much of it you're consuming. I remember a time in the early 2000s where we talked about children being on screens. There was some talk about it actually like killing brain cells, and that has been debunked. But I think there has already been a little bit of, to use a sort of inflammatory word, some hysteria around screen time that that research has shown is probably not true. So I don't want to say like screen time will universally harm your mental health, but I think it's more like we have to be really knowledgeable and aware consumers of screen time. And that's really hard to do because we have this little like genius computer we can carry in our pocket that we can get anything we want that you just like draws our attention. And so it's very hard to be aware of what we're consuming. And I think that's what makes it dangerous, as opposed to just all screen time is bad.
To kind of run with your analogy of it being like food, if you were coming at it from the eating disorder framework of how to manage it or how to conceptualize it, the general trend in terms of how to help people with eating disorders is to take away the moral value that's in food. So there's no longer good food or bad food. It's just food, right? Perhaps with varying levels of nutrition for our body, benefit for our body. So, like you're saying, if you have too much of a certain kind of thing, you might not feel good. And so I think that's probably a good way to consider screen time with regard to mental health. I think screen time can be neutral. I think it can also depend on the person.
Yeah.
I am not a diabetic. So if I eat a whole lot of sugar, I might feel kind of yuck, right? And maybe not so strong and healthy. But if I am diabetic and I eat the same amount of sugar, I can end up in the hospital. So I think it's probably depends a bit on the individual who's consuming the screen time as well. There are some populations that can become more dysregulated, have more trouble sleeping, and have worse anxiety because they're in this doom scrolling, or perhaps it's the pattern in which they use it. Like they're using it to try to fall asleep, but they're just reading all this terrible stuff and then having trouble falling asleep. But there are some people, especially neurodivergent people, who actually can find screen time regulating and beneficial.
Yes. I think that's a great point. Like the neurodivergent piece, there was a dad who created a part in Minecraft. I don't
Oh,
know the
yeah.
Minecraft terms, so I'm not going to use the right words, but he created this like world in Minecraft for his autistic son. And it became this like beautiful place of acceptance and welcoming where other autistic and neurodivergent kids joined and felt like socially accepted, and they were able to make friends. And that's, I think, kind of the bright side of
Mhm.
technology, where you can meet other people that maybe you would have had a hard time coming across in just your regular day-to-day life.
Yeah, it sounds like building some intentionality and awareness of what is impacting you specifically in different ways is really important. I love the food analogy. In my mind, for me, scrolling on Instagram is kind of like dessert.
Mm.
I know if I do too much of this after a while, it will make me not feel great. But if I do set it, have a small amount for 10 minutes or something, I do connect with friends there. I do find things that make me laugh. I want to kind of zero in a little bit on you mentioned neurodivergent and anxiety. For those who maybe have anxiety or depression or ADHD or other diagnoses, what is the impact with adding digital and screen time into the mix? And can it make symptoms worse, or what have you seen there?
Rebecca, do you want to share a little bit about like what is executive functioning? Because, I've seen, I would say, a greater incidence of people coming in with executive dysfunction, which can be a feature of ADHD, but not exclusively.
Yeah, absolutely. The term executive function, if you think of an executive, the one on top, the one making decisions, the one in charge, those are functions in our brain, like, planning ahead, remembering multi-step directions, restraining yourself from saying the first thing that blurts out of your mind, things like that. And that's in what some people might refer to as like the upstairs brain, like the thinking brain, not the downstairs, like reactive, animalistic kind of brain. For people with neurodivergence, the executive functioning can be really impaired. So, when we say neurodivergence, often that's shorthand for like ADHD or autism. There's some other conditions as well. But executive functioning is something that all brains need to be able to do and to manage. And it's not only neurodivergent people who are struggling with executive functioning. So, people with a history of trauma or anxiety or depression, their executive functioning can be impacted as well. Interestingly, a lot of people have been seeking ADHD assessments because they're concerned about their executive function. And it's not necessarily that, oh, you're having trouble with executive functioning, therefore it must be ADHD. The executive dysfunction can be because of several things. But I also think that the media that we consume can be helpful or harmful with that.
That is the way that I think screen time and just like constant exposure to devices or the constant expectation to be engaging in tasks has maybe altered people's expectations of their brain's ability,
Yeah.
or also created a highly distracting world where even if you are in an in-person meeting, everyone has their computer and their phone or their tablet. And so
Mhm.
you're focusing on a meeting, but you're also answering emails. And then you get a text from someone or your inter-office communication, you're getting messages on that. And so our attention is not meant to be split that way. And so people can maybe come to me or Rebecca or another medical provider and say, I can't pay attention. I'm distracted all the time. And sometimes what happens is they're just being distracted by external
Mhm.
forces,
Mhm.
or they're having trouble filtering. And filtering is another one of our executive functions. And there's just so much stimuli happening in the environment. And that's why they can't concentrate.
Absolutely. One of the books that was required reading in one of my grad school courses is a book called Single Tasking by Devora Zach. And the premise behind it is that, our culture tends to almost glorify this ability to quote unquote multitask, to get
Yep.
so much done all at once. But her point, and I think that science backs it up, is that there is really no such thing as multitasking. It's single tasking, it's task switching. So, if you're in that meeting and you get an alert from your phone, you get an alert from Teams, you get an alert about emails, that is a lot of task switching. Now I'm looking at my phone. Now I'm looking at my email. Now I'm trying to pay attention again in this meeting. Yes, we are being distracted by all these different avenues of connectivity. In an interesting way, it also can self perpetuate. We get used to that. We get used to things being in little bursts of information, little bursts, little sound bites, little this and that, rather than practicing sustained attention. We're kept from being bored very much.
Yes.
And
Yes.
I think a lot of us have a decreased ability to sit with the discomfort of boredom.
Mhm.
And there is a lot of power in learning how to sit with being bored and being able to be patient and have that restraint.
Yes, absolutely. And I find in my practice, if I'm doing executive functioning coaching, a really important piece of that is distress tolerance
Yes.
around things like tolerating boredom, managing impulsivity, right? So it's finding that space between the I want to and the actual behavior, and tolerating the emotion of I want to, but I can't.
Mhm.
And Rebecca, you're exactly right when you're saying people don't have as many opportunities to practice that now. So, what that means is people have to make opportunities and then practice it. And that is so much harder than when, we were all kids and we didn't have constant access to devices. We were forced to learn these skills.
Like if you're waiting in line at the grocery store, instead of picking up your phone, maybe just look around you for a few minutes and
Mhm.
be bored and impatient. Wait
Yes.
till your turn to check out.
Yeah.
So we've been talking a lot about the impact of scrolling on our attention spans. And I think one thing I'd really like to talk about too is how being online so much, particularly I think social media with our mental well-being. I've heard it described that we're facing a loneliness epidemic, and it seems like all this online time is a contributing factor. And I wanted to know what you two think about that.
Social media is designed to have this sense that we're creating an online community, but that can really create a false sense of community in the way that was traditionally done, where you actually meet up with the people in real life. You have people you can turn to during times of hardship to lean on to one another, or even during good times to celebrate, right? And instead, when it's all digital, sure, there might be 1,000 followers that might read your stuff or see your videos, but everyone's in their own little silo with their own device. And so it can feel very isolating and make us feel very lonely. And that isn't good for our mental health, because again, our brains they're social creatures. We need one another. And so when our only interaction is through a screen, I think that really does us a disservice in terms of our ability to connect with one another on a real level.
I think also of how easy it is to be inauthentic when you're presenting your life just online and like influencer culture. And yeah, probably some of those people are really showing their authentic lives, but my guess would be the vast majority are showing a facade, right? It's just really kind of the shiny thing, or it's fake, it's digitally altered, it's someone else paid for it and they got lucky. But it creates a sense for the viewer that why isn't my life like that?
Mm.
And if you're seeking some sort of affirmation or connection, and then you see a person and your first thought is, why isn't my life like that? It's very easy to move into self criticism or depression. And if you already are experiencing depression or anxiety, I think it's very easy for social media to make those symptoms worse for you.
I've heard this before. Don't compare your behind the scenes to someone else's highlight reel. And it sounds like it has a real lasting effect, especially if you're already struggling with your mental health.
When I was a teenager, a lot of the focus in terms of like media and mental health was about body image. There was a lot of talk about like what the cover girls look like on magazines that we pass at the grocery store and how those unrealistic beauty standards shape our perspective and can damage our self-esteem or make us have these unrealistic things to compare to. But now it's not just at the grocery store, it's everywhere. And it's not just clothing and our skin and whatnot. It can be the way we are living our life, the vacations, the gifts, the how many people we're hanging out with, like what cool stuff we're doing. And there can be a sense of, fear of missing out, the FOMO, or a sense of inadequacy. A lot of times, social media is essentially like our own individual PR firm. We're putting out this representation of our life, our brand, as some people end up calling it. But real life isn't that way. But if we spend so much time interacting with people, and I use air quotes, interacting with people, when it's really just interacting with their highlights reel, it's hard to get a sense of what is authentic and what a whole person is like, because it's not all shiny and beautiful and fun, and that's okay. That's part of being a human, right? And I think we forget that aspect.
And that's distorted view on the world, right? It's so easy to end up in this very tiny bubble online, whether that my body should look a certain way or the world is a dangerous place or even people are out to get me. The internet will curate that belief for you if you input enough. And so that's the benefit, I think, of kind of going out into the real world to say, other people look this way, other people look a lot of different ways. There are safe experiences to have. People are kind to me, and you get to sort of be challenged in some of those thoughts or beliefs that might be distorted that are going to be reinforced to you if you're just online.
I think too, to the point on the cover girls, that used to be, those are the rich and famous. And now you're comparing yourself to your neighbor, or the influencer who feels like your neighbor is just another mom or another working professional or whoever it might be that you compare yourself to. And I want to talk a little bit too about how this impacts our kids, because I know you've got some really influenced minds who are teens and preteens and then even younger. My daughter is in kindergarten and she's not on social media, but even the screen time impact on her brain seems pretty evident. So can we touch on what the impact has been on children with screen time?
Yeah, I think there's like a couple points to it. One is absolutely the influence. So that confirmation bias can start happening very young. If your child watches one video, you'll see they're just going to get that same type of video repeatedly offered to them. So if your child watches a makeup video, pretty soon your child is going to think they should be wearing makeup. And maybe if they're a teenager, that's fine. But if they're 7, you as a parent need to decide if you want them to be viewing that or not. So what this really means, like it goes back to we parents have to be pretty aware consumers of the content that our children are viewing. Because, like, those parental filters are fine, but they're not going to filter for our values. They're going to filter for what may or may not be appropriate, but they're not going to filter for what we actually want to be teaching our children. They're not going to be filtering for what people are saying, how people are treating each other, how people are presenting what a body should look like, or a relationship should look like, or a friendship should be like. And that really comes down to values. And those are things that children learn by watching a society, by watching a family, by spending time with friends. The other piece that maybe impacts parents of younger kids more is learning. Can your child learn through a screen? And I can't give a definitive age. I'm sure there's someone who knows a lot more about it than me who could. But younger children, certainly like 5 and younger, do not learn through screen time. Now, it doesn't mean that it's like rotting their brain to be on a screen, but the way I like to think about screen time, especially for very young kids, is even if it's not hurting them, they're missing an opportunity to learn. They're missing an opportunity to be social. And so that's just something for us to consider. How much screen time do I want my 4-year-old to have versus how much time do I want them to be learning and socializing?
Or to go back to what we were talking about before, it's an opportunity that they're missing to be bored.
Right.
Yes, exactly.
Kids can't do that these days.
That's right.
You have to consider the content and the messaging and the content that they're seeing, but also what they're missing out on instead, connecting with people, connecting with being bored, connecting with nature, all sorts of different things. And then, of course, the type of content that kids are watching, if it is those really short, rapid videos versus perhaps like a whole episode of a show that's age appropriate, a lot of those rapid fire like reels on TikTok and Instagram, things like that, each one of those gives a little dopamine hit. It's very rewarding. It's very enticing. We want more. It's designed to make us want more. As adults, we can struggle with that, and we can struggle with our impulsivity. Young kids, their brains are still developing, and they really do need the opportunity to learn these executive functioning skills. And the more we give them to prevent them from learning how to be bored, learning how to manage their time, learning the executive functioning skills, the more they're going to have trouble with that later. And it's going to be harder to step away from the screen later. The research is really showing that the more use of technology and screen times in schooling, the less their brains are having to be worked in the way that previous generations have. That suggests perhaps that there is too much of a good thing for children, but I don't think there is a measured amount at this point.
That, I think, is a great point to take a pause in our discussion. We've done a lot of talk about kind of the issue at hand and all the many, many impacts this digital overload is having on our lives, on our children's lives. And what we will do is we'll get back together in a part 2 of this episode and talk through what we can do about that and how we can improve our mental well-being, our executive functioning, our sense of connection. And would love to dive in deeper with that with the both of you. So Catherine and Rebecca, thank you so much for taking this time to discuss this with me.
Thanks for having us, Kristen.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
This has been We Are Valley, a podcast produced by Valley Medical Center in Renton, Washington, as a part of our mission to care for our community like family. If you liked this episode, be sure to subscribe to our feed for more great health content. And for more health resources or to find a provider, visit valleymed.org. Thank you for joining us.